The Boscombe Valley Mystery. The morning sun was casting a warm glow through the window as my wife and I were enjoying breakfast. Suddenly, the maid entered, bringing a telegram with her. It was from Sherlock Holmes, and it read, "Have you a couple of days to spare? Have just been wired for from the west of England in connection with Boscombe Valley tragedy. Shall be glad if you will come with me. Air and scenery, perfect. Leave Paddington by the 11:15. My wife, ever supportive of my adventures with Holmes, looked at me expectantly. "What do you say, dear? Will you go?" "I'm not sure," I confessed. "My schedule is pretty full at the moment." "Oh, Anstruther can handle your work for you," she said. "You've been looking a bit pale lately. I think a change of scenery would do you good. And you're always so interested in Mr. Holmes's cases." She was right, of course. How could I resist a chance to work with Holmes, especially after the benefits I had gained from our previous collaborations? "I'd be ungrateful if I didn't," I agreed. "But if I'm going, I need to pack immediately. I only have half an hour." My experience in Afghanistan, living in rugged camps, had turned me into a quick and efficient traveler. I had minimal needs, so within the allotted time I was in a cab with my suitcase, heading towards Paddington Station. On the platform, Sherlock Holmes was pacing back and forth, his tall, gaunt figure enhanced by his long gray traveling cloak and close-fitting cap. He looked even more imposing than usual. "It's really very good of you to come, Watson," he said, his voice echoing with genuine gratitude. "Having someone I can completely rely on makes a world of difference. Local help is always either useless or biased. If you'll keep the two-corner seats, I'll get the tickets." We had the carriage to ourselves, save for a mountain of papers Holmes had brought with him. He delved into them, reading, making notes, and pausing for reflection, until we were past reading. Then, with a swift motion, he bundled the papers into a giant ball and tossed them onto the luggage rack. "Have you heard anything about the case?" he asked, his eyes alight with anticipation. "Not a word," I replied. "I haven't seen a paper in days. The London press hasn't given much detail. I've just been going through all the recent papers to get the facts straight. It seems, from what I gather, to be one of those simple cases that are so incredibly difficult." "That sounds a bit paradoxical," I remarked, intrigued by his statement. "But it's profoundly true," he said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "Uniqueness is almost always a clue. The more ordinary and unremarkable a crime is, the harder it is to solve. However, in this case, they've built a very strong case against the son of the murdered man." "It's a murder, then?" I asked, the gravity of the situation settling in. "Well, it's believed to be," he said, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. "I won't take anything for granted until I've personally looked into it. Let me explain the situation as I understand it, in a nutshell." He leaned back in his seat, his voice taking on a more measured tone. "Boscombe Valley is a rural area near Ross, in Herefordshire. The largest landowner there is a Mr. John Turner, who made his fortune in Australia and returned to England years ago. He rented one of his farms, Hatherley, to Mr. Charles McCarthy, also an ex-Australian. They knew each other from the colonies, so it's not surprising that they settled near each other. Turner was apparently the wealthier of the two, so McCarthy became his tenant, but remained on an equal footing, as they were often seen together. McCarthy had one son, an 18-year-old, and Turner had an only daughter of the same age, but neither had wives. They seem to have avoided socializing with the local English families and lived fairly private lives, though both the McCarthys enjoyed sports and were regular attendees at the local races. McCarthy employed 2 servants, a man and a girl. Turner had a larger household, at least half a dozen people. That's all I've managed to piece together about the families. Now for the facts. On June 3rd, last Monday, McCarthy left his home at Hatherley around 3 in the afternoon and walked down to Boscombe Pool, a small lake formed by the stream running through the Boscombe Valley. He'd been out in Ross with his servant in the morning, and he'd told the man he had to hurry, as he had an important appointment at 3. He never returned from that appointment. It's a quarter of a mile from Hatherley Farmhouse to Boscombe Pool, and 2 people saw him as he passed. One was an old woman, whose name wasn't recorded, and the other was William Crowder, a gamekeeper employed by Mr. Turner. Both witnesses stated that Mr. McCarthy was walking alone. The gamekeeper added that within minutes of seeing Mr. McCarthy, he saw his son, Mr. James McCarthy, going the same way with a gun under his arm. To the best of his knowledge, he actually saw the father at that moment, and the son was following him. He didn't think much of it until he heard in the evening about the tragedy that had occurred. The 2 McCarthys were seen after William Crowder, the gamekeeper, lost sight of them. Boscombe Pool is surrounded by thick woods, with just a fringe of grass and reeds around the edge. Patience Moran, a 14-year-old girl, daughter of the lodge keeper of the Boscombe Valley estate, was in the woods picking flowers. She said that while she was there, she saw Mr. McCarthy and his son by the edge of the woods near the lake, and that they seemed to be having a heated argument. She heard the elder McCarthy using very strong language towards his son, and she saw the son raise his hand as if to strike his father. She was so frightened by their violence that she ran away, telling her mother when she got home that she'd left the 2 McCarthys arguing near Boscombe Pool, and that she was afraid they were going to fight. She'd barely finished speaking when young Mr. McCarthy came running up to the lodge, saying he'd found his father dead in the woods and asking for the lodge keeper's help. He was very agitated, without his gun or his hat, and his right hand and sleeve were stained with fresh blood. Following him, they found the dead body lying on the grass by the pool. The head had been beaten in by repeated blows from a heavy, blunt weapon. The injuries were consistent with those that could have been inflicted by the butt end of his son's gun, which was found lying on the grass a few feet from the body. Under these circumstances, the young man was immediately arrested, and a verdict of willful murder was returned at the inquest on Tuesday. He was brought before the magistrates at Ross on Wednesday, who referred the case to the next assizes. These are the main facts of the case as presented to the coroner and the police court. "I can't imagine a more damning case," I remarked, shaken by the evidence. "If ever circumstantial evidence pointed to a criminal, it does so here." "Circumstantial evidence is a tricky thing," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "It may seem to point very directly to one thing, but if you shift your perspective slightly, you may find it pointing just as strongly to something entirely different. It must be admitted, however, that the case looks extremely serious against the young man, and it's quite possible that he is indeed the culprit. However, there are several people in the neighborhood, including Miss Turner, the daughter of the neighboring landowner, who believe in his innocence and have hired Lestrade, who you may remember from the Study in Scarlet, to work on the case in his interest. Lestrade, rather puzzled, has referred the case to me, and that's why 2 middle-aged gentlemen are flying westward at 50 miles an hour instead of quietly enjoying their breakfasts at home. "I'm afraid," I said, "that the facts are so obvious that you'll find little credit to be gained from this case." "There's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact," he answered, a playful glint in his eyes. "Besides, we might stumble upon other obvious facts that weren't at all obvious to Mr. Lestrade. You know me too well to think that I'm boasting when I say that I'll either confirm or disprove his theory by means that he's completely incapable of employing or even understanding. To take the first example that comes to mind, I clearly perceive that in your bedroom, the window is on the right-hand side. Yet, I doubt whether Mr. Lestrade would have noticed even something as self-evident as that." "How on earth?" I began, my curiosity piqued. "My dear fellow, I know you well. I know the military neatness that defines you. You shave every morning, and in this season, you shave by sunlight. But since your shaving is less and less complete as we move to the left side until it becomes downright sloppy around the corner of your jaw, it's clear that that side receives less illumination than the other. I can't imagine a man of your habits looking at himself in equal light and being satisfied with such a result. I only cite this as a trivial example of observation and inference. That's my specialty, and it's quite possible that it will be of some service in the investigation ahead. There are a couple of minor points that came up in the inquest that are worth considering. What are they? I asked, eager to learn more about his thought process. It seems that his arrest didn't happen immediately, but after the return to Hatherley Farm. When the Inspector of Constabulary informed him he was under arrest, he remarked that he wasn't surprised to hear it, and that it was no more than his deserts. This observation naturally had the effect of removing any lingering doubts in the minds of the coroner's jury. "It was a confession," I exclaimed, my mind racing to connect the dots. "No, because it was followed by a protestation of innocence," Holmes said, his voice calm and measured. "Coming on top of such a damning series of events, it was at least a very suspicious remark," I argued, still uncertain about the young man's guilt. "On the contrary," said Holmes, his eyes gleaming with a newfound insight. "It's the brightest ray of hope I see at the moment. However innocent he might be, he couldn't be such a complete imbecile as not to see that the circumstances were heavily against him. Had he appeared surprised at his own arrest, or feigned indignation, I would have considered it highly suspicious because such surprise or anger wouldn't be natural under the circumstances, yet might appear to be the best course of action for a cunning man. His frank acceptance of the situation marks him as either an innocent man or a man of considerable self-control and firmness. As for his remark about his deserts, it's not unnatural if you consider that he stood beside his father's dead body, and that there's no doubt he had that very day so far forgotten his filial duty as to argue with his father, and even, according to the little girl whose evidence is so crucial, to raise his hand as if to strike him. The self-reproach and remorse displayed in his remark seemed to me to be signs of a healthy mind, rather than a guilty one. I shook my head, still not entirely convinced. "Many men have been hanged on far less evidence," I remarked. "So they have, and many men have been wrongly hanged," Holmes acknowledged, his tone grave. "What is the young man's own account of the matter?" I asked, eager to hear the young man's perspective. "It's not very encouraging to his supporters, I'm afraid, though there are a couple of points that are suggestive. You'll find it here. You can read it for yourself," he said, extracting a copy of the local Herefordshire paper from his bundle. He unfolded the paper and pointed out the paragraph where the unfortunate young man had given his own statement of what had occurred. I settled into the corner of the carriage and read it very carefully. It went like this. Mr. James McCarthy, the only son of the deceased, was then called and gave evidence as follows. I had been away from home for 3 days at Bristol, and had only just returned on the morning of last Monday, the 3rd. My father was absent from home at the time of my arrival, and I was informed by the maid that he had driven over to Ross with John Cobb, the groom. Shortly after my return, I heard the wheels of his trap in the yard, and, looking out of my window, I saw him get out and walk rapidly out of the yard, though I was not aware in which direction he was going. I then took my gun and strolled out in the direction of the Boscombe Pool, with the intention of visiting the rabbit warren, which is upon the other side. On my way, I saw William Crowder, the gamekeeper, as he had stated in his evidence, but he is mistaken in thinking that I was following my father. I had no idea that he was in front of me. When about 100 yards from the pool, I heard a cry of "Cooey!" which was a usual signal between my father and myself. I then hurried forward and found him standing by the pool. He appeared to be much surprised at seeing me and asked me rather roughly what I was doing there. A conversation ensued, which led to high words and almost to blows, for my father was a man of a very violent temper. Seeing that his passion was becoming ungovernable, I left him and returned towards Hatherley Farm. I had not gone more than 150 yards, however, when I heard a hideous outcry behind me, which caused me to run back again. I found my father expiring upon the ground, with his head terribly injured. I dropped my gun and held him in my arms, but he almost instantly expired. I knelt beside him for some minutes, and then made my way to Mr. Turner's lodge-keeper, his house being the nearest, to ask for assistance. I saw no one near my father when I returned, and I have no idea how he came by his injuries. He was not a popular man, being somewhat cold and forbidding in his manners, but he had, as far as I know, no active enemies. I know nothing further of the matter. The coroner: Did your father make any statement to you before he died? Witness: He mumbled a few words, but I could only catch some allusion to a rat. The coroner: What did you understand by that? Witness: It conveyed no meaning to me. I thought that he was delirious. The coroner: What was the point upon which you and your father had this final quarrel? Witness: I should prefer not to answer. The coroner: I am afraid that I must press it. Witness: It is really impossible for me to tell you. I can assure you that it has nothing to do with the sad tragedy which followed. The coroner: That is for the court to decide. I need not point out to you that your refusal to answer will prejudice your case considerably in any future proceedings which may arise. Witness: I must still refuse. The coroner: I understand that the cry of coo-ee was a common signal between you and your father. Witness: It was. The coroner: How was it, then, that he uttered it before he saw you, and before he even knew that you had returned from Bristol? Witness, with considerable confusion: I do not know. A juryman: Did you see nothing which aroused your suspicions when you returned on hearing the cry and found your father fatally injured? Witness: Nothing definite. The coroner: What do you mean? Witness: I was so disturbed and excited as I rushed out into the open that I could think of nothing except of my father. Yet I have a vague impression that as I ran forward something lay upon the ground to the left of me. It seemed to me to be something gray in color, a coat of some sort, or a plaid perhaps. When I rose from my father, I looked round for it, but it was gone. Do you mean that it disappeared before you went for help? Yes, it was gone. You cannot say what it was? No, I had a feeling something was there. How far from the body? 12 yards or so. And how far from the edge of the wood? About the same. Then, if it was removed, it was while you were within 12 yards of it? Yes, but with my back towards it. This concluded the examination of the witness. I see, I said, glancing down the column, that the coroner, in his concluding remarks, was rather harsh on young McCarthy. He highlights, with reason, the discrepancy about his father signaling to him before seeing him, as well as his refusal to provide details of his conversation with his father, and his strange account of his father's dying words. They are all, as he remarks, very much against the son. Holmes chuckled softly to himself and stretched out on the cushioned seat. Both you and the coroner have been at pains, he said, to point out the very strongest points in the young man's favor. Don't you see that you're alternately giving him credit for having too much imagination and too little? Too little, if he couldn't invent a cause of quarrel that would garner sympathy from the jury. Too much, if he conjured up from his own mind something as outlandish as a dying reference to a rat, and the incident of the disappearing cloth. No, sir, I'll approach this case from the perspective that what this young man says is true, and we'll see where that hypothesis leads us. And now here's my pocket Petrarch, and not another word shall I say of this case until we're on the scene of action. We lunch at Swindon, and I see we'll be there in 20 minutes. It was nearly 4 o'clock when we finally, after passing through the beautiful Stroud Valley and over the broad, gleaming Severn, arrived in the pretty little country town of Ross. A lean, ferret-like man, furtive and sly-looking, was waiting for us on the platform. Despite the light brown dust coat and leather leggings he wore in deference to his rustic surroundings, I had no trouble recognizing Lestrade of Scotland Yard. With him, we drove to the Hereford Arms, where a room had already been booked for us. "I've ordered a carriage," Lestrade announced as we sat over a cup of tea. "I know your energetic nature, and I figured you wouldn't be content until you'd seen the crime scene." "Very kind of you to anticipate my needs," Holmes replied with a hint of amusement in his voice. "It's entirely a matter of barometric pressure." Lestrade looked bewildered. "I don't quite follow," he said, his brow furrowed. "How's the glass? 29, I see. No wind and not a cloud in the sky. I have a case full of cigarettes here that need smoking, and the sofa is far superior to the usual country hotel monstrosity. I don't think it's likely I'll be needing the carriage tonight." Lestrade chuckled indulgently. "You've no doubt already formed your conclusions from the newspapers," he said. "The case is as clear as day. The more you look into it, the clearer it becomes. Still, of course, one can't refuse a lady, and such a very insistent one, too. She's heard of you, and she wants your opinion, even though I repeatedly told her there was nothing you could do that I hadn't already done. Why, bless my soul, here's her carriage at the door." He hadn't finished speaking before a beautiful young woman rushed into the room. She was the most stunning young woman I had ever seen, her violet eyes sparkling, lips slightly parted, and a rosy flush on her cheeks. Her usual reserve had vanished, replaced by overwhelming excitement and concern. "Oh, Mr. Sherlock Holmes!" she exclaimed, her gaze flitting between us before settling on my companion as if drawn by an invisible force. "I'm so glad you've come. I drove all the way down to tell you. I know that James didn't do it. I know it. And I want you to start your work knowing that, too. Never doubt it for a moment. We've known each other since we were children, and I know his flaws like no one else does. But he's too kind-hearted to hurt a fly. This accusation is absurd to anyone who truly knows him." "I hope we can clear him, Miss Turner," Sherlock Holmes assured her. "You can rely on me doing everything I can." "But you've read the evidence. You've formed some conclusion. Don't you see some loophole, some flaw? Don't you yourself think he's innocent?" "I think it's very probable," Holmes replied, his voice measured. "There now!" she cried, throwing back her head and looking defiantly at Lestrade. "You hear, he gives me hope." Lestrade shrugged his shoulders. "I'm afraid my colleague has been a little hasty in forming his conclusions," he said, trying to maintain his composure. "But he's right. Oh, I know he's right. James never did it. And about his quarrel with his father, I'm sure the reason he wouldn't speak about it to the coroner is because I was involved in it." "In what way?" Holmes asked, his keen eyes fixed on her. "It's no time for me to hide anything. James and his father had many disagreements about me. Mr. McCarthy was very anxious that there should be a marriage between us. James and I have always loved each other as brother and sister, but, of course, he's young and hasn't seen much of life yet, well, he naturally didn't want to do anything like that yet. So, there were arguments, and this, I'm sure, was one of them." "And your father?" Holmes asked, his voice smooth and inquiring. "Was he in favor of such a union?" "No, he was against it too. No one but Mr. McCarthy was in favor of it." A quick blush spread across her fresh young face as Holmes shot one of his sharp, penetrating glances at her. "Thank you for this information," he said, acknowledging her honesty. "May I see your father if I call tomorrow?" "I'm afraid the doctor won't allow it." "The doctor?" "Yes. Haven't you heard? Poor father hasn't been strong for years, but this has broken him completely. He's taken to his bed, and Dr. Willows says he's a wreck. His nervous system is shattered." Mr. McCarthy was the only man alive who knew Dad in the old days in Victoria. "Ha! In Victoria! That's important." "Yes, at the mines." "Quite so, at the gold mines, where, as I understand, Mr. Turner made his money." "Yes, certainly. Thank you, Miss Turner. You've been of material assistance to me. You'll tell me if you have any news tomorrow. No doubt you'll go to the prison to see James. Oh, if you do, Mr. Holmes, please tell him that I know he's innocent." "I will, Miss Turner. I must go home now. Dad is very ill, and he misses me so much if I leave him. Goodbye, and God help you in your undertaking." She hurried from the room as impulsively as she had entered, the sound of her carriage wheels fading into the distance. "I am ashamed of you, Holmes," Lestrade said with dignity after a few minutes' silence. "Why should you raise hopes you're bound to disappoint? I'm not overly tender-hearted, but I call it cruel." "I think I see a way to clear James McCarthy," Holmes replied, his gaze unwavering. "Do you have an order to see him in prison?" "Yes, but only for you and me." "Then I shall reconsider my resolution about going out. We have still time to take a train to Hereford and see him tonight." "Ample? Then let us do so. Watson, I fear you'll find it very slow, but I shall only be away a couple of hours." I walked to the station with them and then wandered through the streets of the little town, eventually returning to the hotel. I settled on the sofa and tried to engage with a yellow-backed novel, but the flimsy plot seemed so thin compared to the profound mystery we were grappling with. My attention kept wandering from the story to the facts of the case, until I finally tossed the book across the room and surrendered entirely to considering the day's events. Assuming that this unfortunate young man's story were absolutely true, then what terrifying thing, what absolutely unforeseen and extraordinary calamity could have occurred between the time when he parted from his father and the moment when, drawn back by his screams, he rushed into the glade? It was something terrible and deadly. What could it be? Might not the nature of the injuries reveal something to my medical instincts? I rang the bell and called for the weekly county paper, which contained a verbatim account of the inquest. In the surgeon's deposition, it was stated that the posterior third of the left parietal bone and the left half of the occipital bone had been shattered by a heavy blow from a blunt weapon. I marked the spot upon my own head. Clearly such a blow must have been struck from behind. That was to some extent in favor of the accused, as when seen quarreling he was face to face with his father. Still, it did not go for very much, for the older man might have turned his back before the blow fell. Still, it might be worthwhile to call Holmes' attention to it. Then there was the peculiar dying reference to a rat. What could that mean? It could not be delirium. A man dying from a sudden blow does not commonly become delirious. No, it was more likely to be an attempt to explain how he met his fate. But what could it indicate? I cudgeled my brains to find some possible explanation. And then, the incident of the gray cloth seen by young McCarthy. If that were true, the murderer must have dropped some part of his dress, presumably his overcoat, in his flight, and must have had the hardihood to return and to carry it away at the instant when the sun was kneeling with his back turned not a dozen paces off. What a tissue of mysteries and improbabilities the whole thing was. I did not wonder at Lestrade's opinion, and yet I had so much faith in Sherlock Holmes's insight that I could not lose hope as long as every fresh fact seemed to strengthen his conviction of young McCarthy's innocence. It was late before Sherlock Holmes returned. He came back alone, for Lestrade was staying in lodgings in the town. "The glass still keeps very high," he remarked as he sat down. It is of importance that it should not rain before we are able to go over the ground. On the other hand, a man should be at his very best and keenest for such nice work as that, and I did not wish to do it when fagged by a long journey. I have seen young McCarthy. And what did you learn from him? Nothing. Could he throw no light? None at all. I was inclined to think at one time that he knew who had done it and was screening him or her, but I am convinced now that he is as puzzled as everyone else. He is not a very quick-witted youth, though comely to look at, and, I should think, sound at heart. I cannot admire his taste, I remarked, if it is indeed a fact that he was averse to a marriage with so charming a young lady as this Miss Turner. Ah, thereby hangs a rather painful tale. This fellow is madly, insanely in love with her. But some 2 years ago, when he was only a lad, and before he really knew her, for she had been away 5 years at a boarding school, what does the idiot do but get into the clutches of a barmaid in Bristol and marry her at a registry office? No one knows a word of the matter, but you can imagine how maddening it must be to him to be upbraided for not doing what he would give his very eyes to do, but what he knows to be absolutely impossible. It was sheer frenzy of this sort which made him throw his hands up into the air when his father, at their last interview, was goading him on to propose to Miss Turner. On the other hand, he had no means of supporting himself, and his father, who was by all accounts a very hard man, would have thrown him over utterly had he known the truth. It was with his barmaid wife that he had spent the last 3 days in Bristol, and his father did not know where he was. Mark that point. It is of importance. Good has come out of evil, however, for the barmaid. Finding from the papers that he is in serious trouble and likely to be hanged, has thrown him over utterly, and has written to him to say that she has a husband already in the Bermuda dockyard, so that there is really no tie between them. I think that bit of news has consoled young McCarthy for all that he has suffered. But if he is innocent, who has done it? Ah, who? I would call your attention very particularly to 2 points. One is that the murdered man had an appointment with someone at the pool, and that the someone could not have been his son, for his son was away, and he did not know when he would return. The second is that the murdered man was heard to cry cooey before he knew that his son had returned. Those are the crucial points upon which the case depends. And now let us talk about George Meredith, if you please, and we shall leave all minor matters until tomorrow. There was no rain, as Holmes had foretold, and the morning broke bright and cloudless. At 9 o'clock, Lestrade called for us with the carriage, and we set off for Hatherley Farm and the Boscombe Pool. "There is serious news this morning," Lestrade observed. "It is said that Mr. Turner of the Hall is so ill that his life is despaired of." "An elderly man, I presume," said Holmes, "about 60, but his constitution has been shattered by his life abroad, and he has been in failing health for some time. This business has had a very bad effect upon him. He was an old friend of McCarthy's, and, I may add, a great benefactor to him, for I have learned that he gave him Hatherley Farm rent-free." "Indeed, that is interesting," said Holmes. "Oh, yes. In 100 other ways he has helped him. Everybody about here speaks of his kindness to him." "Really, does it not strike you as a little singular that this McCarthy, who appears to have had little of his own and to have been under such obligations to Turner, should still talk of marrying his son to Turner's daughter, who is, presumably, heiress to the estate, and that in such a very cocksure manner as if it were merely a case of a proposal and all else would follow? It is the more strange since we know that Turner himself was averse to the idea. The daughter told us as much. Do you not deduce something from that?" "We have got to the deductions and the inferences," said Lestrade, winking at me. "I find it hard enough to tackle facts, Holmes, without flying away after theories and fancies." "You are right," said Holmes demurely. "You do find it very hard to tackle the facts. Anyhow, "I have grasped one fact which you seem to find it difficult to get hold of," replied Lestrade with some warmth, "and that is that McCarthy Sr. met his death from McCarthy Jr., and that all theories to the contrary are the merest moonshine." "Well, moonshine is a brighter thing than fog," said Holmes, laughing, "but I am very much mistaken if this is not Hatherley Farm upon the left." "Yes, that is it." It was a widespread, comfortable-looking building, two-storied, slate-roofed, with great yellow blotches of lichen upon the gray walls. The drawn blinds and the smokeless chimneys, however, gave it a stricken look, as though the weight of this horror still lay heavy upon it. We called at the door, when the maid, at Holmes's request, showed us the boots which her master wore at the time of his death, and also a pair of the son's, though not the pair which he had then had. Having measured these very carefully from 7 or 8 different points, Holmes desired to be led to the courtyard, from which we all followed the winding track which led to Boscombe Pool. Sherlock Holmes was transformed when he was hot upon such a scent as this. Men who had only known the quiet thinker and logician of Baker Street would have failed to recognize him. His face flushed and darkened. His brows were drawn into 2 hard black lines, while his eyes shone out from beneath them with a steely glitter. His face was bent downward, his shoulders bowed, his lips compressed, and the veins stood out like whipcord in his long, sinewy neck. His nostrils seemed to dilate with a purely animal lust for the chase, and his mind was so absolutely concentrated upon the matter before him that a question or remark fell unheeded upon his ears, or, at the most, only provoked a quick, impatient snarl in reply. Swiftly and silently he made his way along the track which ran through the meadows, and so by way of the woods to the Boscombe Pool. It was damp, marshy ground, as is all that district, and there were marks of many feet, both upon the path and amid the short grass, which bounded it on either side. Sometimes Holmes would hurry on, sometimes stop dead, and once he made quite a little detour into the meadow. Lestrade and I walked behind him, the detective indifferent and contemptuous, while I watched my friend with the interest which sprang from the conviction that every one of his actions was directed towards a definite end. The Boscombe Pool, which is a little reed-girt sheet of water some 50 yards across, is situated at the boundary between the Hatherley Farm and the private park of the wealthy Mr. Turner. Above the woods which lined it upon the farther side we could see the red, jutting pinnacles, which marked the site of the rich landowner's dwelling. On the Hatherley side of the pool the woods grew very thick, and there was a narrow belt of sodden grass 20 paces across, between the edge of the trees and the reeds which lined the lake. Lestrade showed us the exact spot at which the body had been found, and, indeed, so moist was the ground that I could plainly see the traces which had been left by the fall of the stricken man. To Holmes, as I could see by his eager face and peering eyes, very many other things were to be read upon the trampled grass. He ran round, like a dog who is picking up a scent, and then turned upon my companion. "What did you go into the pool for?" he asked. "I fished about with a rake. I thought there might be some weapon or other trace. But how on earth—" "Oh, tut, tut! I have no time. That left foot of yours with its inward twist is all over the place. A mole could trace it, and there it vanishes among the reeds. Oh, how simple it would all have been had I been here before they came like a herd of buffalo and wallowed all over it. Here is where the party with the lodge-keeper came, and they have covered all tracks for 6 or 8 feet round the body. But here are 3 separate tracks of the same feet." He drew out a lens and lay down upon his waterproof to have a better view, talking all the time rather to himself than to us. "These are young McCarthy's feet. Twice he was walking, and once he ran swiftly, so that the soles are deeply marked and the heels hardly visible. That bears out his story. He ran when he saw his father on the ground. Then here are the father's feet, as he paced up and down. "What is this, then?" "It is the butt end of the gun, as the son stood listening. And this? Ha ha! What have we here? Tiptoes, tiptoes. Square, too. Quite unusual boots. They come, they go, they come again. Of course, that was for the cloak. Now, where did they come from?" He ran up and down, sometimes losing, sometimes finding the track until we were well within the edge of the wood and under the shadow of a great beech, the largest tree in the neighborhood. Holmes traced his way to the farther side of this and lay down once more upon his face, with a little cry of satisfaction. For a long time he remained there, turning over the leaves and dried sticks, gathering up what seemed to me to be dust into an envelope, and examining with his lens not only the ground, but even the bark of the tree as far as he could reach. A jagged stone was lying among the moss, and this also he carefully examined and retained. Then he followed a pathway through the wood until he came to the high road, where all traces were lost. "It has been a case of considerable interest," Holmes remarked, returning to his usual calm demeanor. "I believe this gray house on the right must be the lodge. I think I'll go in and have a word with Moran, and perhaps write a little note. Once that's done, we can drive back for our luncheon. You can walk to the cab, and I'll be with you presently." It was about 10 minutes before we reached our cab and drove back to Ross, Holmes still carrying the stone he had found in the woods. "This might interest you, Lestrade," he said, holding it out. "The murder was done with it." "I don't see any marks." "There are none." "How do you know, then?" "The grass was growing under it. It had only been there a few days. There was no sign of a place whence it had been taken. It corresponds with the injuries. There is no sign of any other weapon." "And the murderer?" "Is a tall man, left-handed, limps with the right leg, wears thick-soled shooting boots and a gray cloak, smokes Indian cigars, uses a cigar holder, and carries a blunt penknife in his pocket. There are several other indications, but these may be enough to aid us in our search." Lestrade laughed. "I'm afraid I'm still a skeptic," he said. "Theories are all very well, but we have to deal with a hard-headed British jury." "We shall see," Holmes answered calmly. "You work your own method, and I shall work mine. I shall be busy this afternoon, and shall probably return to London by the evening train." "And leave your case unfinished?" "No, finished. But the mystery? It is solved." "Who was the criminal, then?" "The gentleman I described." "But who is he?" "Surely it wouldn't be difficult to find out. This isn't such a populous neighborhood." Lestrade shrugged his shoulders. "I'm a practical man," he said, "and I really can't undertake to go about the country looking for a left-handed gentleman with a game leg. I would become the laughingstock of Scotland Yard." "All right," said Holmes quietly. "I've given you the chance. Here are your lodgings. Goodbye. I'll drop you a line before I leave." Having left Lestrade at his rooms, we drove to our hotel, where lunch was waiting for us. Holmes was silent, buried in thought, with a pained expression on his face, as if wrestling with a perplexing situation. "Look here, Watson," he said when the table was cleared. "Just sit down in this chair and let me preach to you for a little. I don't know quite what to do, and I would value your advice. Light a cigar and let me expound." "Pray do so." "Well, now, in considering this case, there are 2 points about young McCarthy's narrative that struck us both instantly, although they impressed me in his favor and you against him. One was the fact that his father should, according to his account, cry cooey before seeing him. The other was his singular dying reference to a rat. He mumbled several words, you understand, but that was all that caught the son's ear. Now, from this double point our research must commence, and we will begin it by presuming that what the lad says is absolutely true. What of this cooey, then? Well, obviously it couldn't have been meant for the son. The son, as far as he knew, was in Bristol. It was mere chance that he was within earshot. The cooey was meant to attract the attention of whoever it was that he had the appointment with. But cooey is a distinctly Australian cry, and one which is used between Australians. There is a strong presumption that the person whom McCarthy expected to meet him at Boscombe Pool was someone who had been in Australia. What of the rat, then? Sherlock Holmes took a folded paper from his pocket and flattened it out on the table. "This is a map of the colony of Victoria," he said. "I wired to Bristol for it last night." He placed his hand over to part of the map. "What do you read?" "Arat," I read. "And now?" He raised his hand. "Ballarat." "Quite so. That was the word the man uttered, and of which his son only caught the last 2 syllables. He was trying to utter the name of his murderer, so-and-so of Ballarat." "It is wonderful!" I exclaimed. "It is obvious." And now, you see, I had narrowed the field down considerably. The possession of a gray garment was a third point which, granting the son's statement to be correct, was a certainty. We have come now out of mere vagueness to the definite conception of an Australian from Ballarat with a grey cloak. Certainly, and one who was at home in the district, for the pool can only be approached by the farm or by the estate, where strangers could hardly wander. Quite so. Then comes our expedition of today. By an examination of the ground, I gained the trifling details which I gave to that imbecile Lestrade as to the personality of the criminal. But how did you gain them? You know my method. It is founded upon the observation of trifles. His height I know that you might roughly judge from the length of his stride. His boots, too, might be told from their traces. Yes, they were peculiar boots. But his lameness? The impression of his right foot was always less distinct than his left. He put less weight upon it. Why? Because he limped. He was lame. But his left-handedness? You were yourself struck by the nature of the injury, as recorded by the surgeon at the inquest. The blow was struck from immediately behind, and yet was upon the left side. Now, how can that be unless it were by a left-handed man? He had stood behind that tree during the interview between the father and son. He had even smoked there. I found the ash of a cigar, which my special knowledge of tobacco ashes enables me to pronounce as an Indian cigar. I have, as you know, devoted some attention to this, and written a little monograph on the ashes of 140 different varieties of pipe, cigar, and cigarette tobacco. Having found the ash, I then looked round and discovered the stump among the moss where he had tossed it. It was an Indian cigar, of the variety which are rolled in Rotterdam. And the cigar holder? I could see that the end had not been in his mouth. Therefore he used a holder. The tip had been cut off, not bitten off, but the cut was not a clean one, so I deduced a blunt penknife. "Holmes," I said, "you have drawn a net round this man from which he cannot escape, and you have saved an innocent human life as truly as if you had cut the cord which was hanging him. I see the direction in which all this points. The culprit is—" "Mr. John Turner," cried the hotel waiter, opening the door of our sitting room and ushering in a visitor. The man who entered was a strange and impressive figure. His slow, limping step and bowed shoulders gave the appearance of decrepitude, and yet his hard, deep-lined, craggy features and his enormous limbs showed that he was possessed of unusual strength of body and of character. His tangled beard, grizzled hair, and outstanding, drooping eyebrows combined to give an air of dignity and power to his appearance, but his face was of an ashen white, while his lips and the corners of his nostrils were tinged with a shade of blue. It was clear to me at a glance that he was in the grip of some deadly and chronic disease. "Pray sit down on the sofa," said Holmes gently. "You had my note?" "Yes, the lodge-keeper brought it up. You said that you wished to see me here to avoid scandal. I thought people would talk if I went to the hall." "And why did you wish to see me?" He looked across at my companion with despair in his weary eyes, as though his question was already answered. "Yes," said Holmes, answering the look rather than the words. "It is so. I know all about McCarthy." The old man sank his face in his hands. "God help me," he cried, "but I would not have let the young man come to harm. I give you my word that I would have spoken out if it went against him at the assizes." "I am glad to hear you say so," said Holmes gravely. "I would have spoken now had it not been for my dear girl. It would break her heart. It will break her heart when she hears that I am arrested." "It may not come to that," said Holmes. "What?" "I am no official agent. I understand that it was your daughter who required my presence here, and I am acting in her interests. Young McCarthy must be got off, however." "I am a dying man," said old Turner. "I have had diabetes for years. My doctor says it is a question whether I shall live a month. Yet I would rather die under my own roof than in a jail." Holmes rose and sat down at the table with his pen in his hand and a bundle of paper before him. "Just tell us the truth," he said. "I shall jot down the facts. You will sign it, and Watson here can witness it. Then I could produce your confession at the last extremity to save young McCarthy. I promise you that I shall not use it unless it is absolutely needed." "It's as well," said the old man. "It's a question whether I shall live to the assizes, so it matters little to me. But I should wish to spare Alice the shock. And now I will make the thing clear to you. It has been a long time in the acting, but will not take me long to tell. You didn't know this dead man, McCarthy. He was a devil incarnate. I tell you that. God keep you out of the clutches of such a man as he. His grip has been upon me these 20 years, and he has blasted my life. I'll tell you first how I came to be in his power. It was in the early 60s at the diggings. I was a young chap then, hot-blooded and reckless, ready to turn my hand at anything. I got among bad companions, took to drink, had no luck with my claim, took to the bush, and in a word became what you would call over here a highway robber. There were 6 of us, and we had a wild, free life of it, sticking up a station from time to time, or stopping the wagons on the road to the diggings. Black Jack of Ballarat was the name I went under, and our party is still remembered in the colony as the Ballarat Gang. One day a gold convoy came down from Ballarat to Melbourne, and we lay in wait for it and attacked it. There were 6 troopers and 6 of us, so it was a close thing, but we emptied 4 of their saddles at the first volley. 3 of our boys were killed, however, before we got the swag. I put my pistol to the head of the wagon driver, who was this very man McCarthy. I wished to the Lord that I had shot him then, but I spared him, though I saw his wicked little eyes fixed on my face, as though to remember every feature. We got away with the gold, became wealthy men, and made our way over to England without being suspected. There I parted from my old pals and determined to settle down to a quiet and respectable life. I bought this estate, which chanced to be in the market, and I set myself to do a little good with my money, to make up for the way in which I had earned it. I married too, and though my wife died young, she left me my dear little Alice. Even when she was just a baby, her wee hand seemed to lead me down the right path as nothing else had ever done. In a word, I turned over a new leaf and did my best to make up for the past. All was going well when McCarthy laid his grip upon me. I had gone up to town about an investment, and I met him in Regent Street with hardly a coat to his back or a boot to his foot. "Here we are, Jack," says he, touching me on the arm. "We'll be as good as a family to you. There's 2 of us, me and my son, and you can have the keeping of us. If you don't, it's a fine law-abiding country as England, and there's always a policeman within hail. Well, Down they came to the West Country. There was no shaking them off. And there they have lived rent-free on my best land ever since. There was no rest for me, no peace, no forgetfulness. Turn where I would, there was his cunning, grinning face at my elbow. It grew worse as Alice grew up, for he soon saw I was more afraid of her knowing my past than of the police. Whatever he wanted he must have, and whatever it was I gave him without question: land, money, houses, until at last he asked a thing which I could not give. He asked for Alice. His son, you see, had grown up, and so had my girl, and as I was known to be in weak health, it seemed a fine stroke to him that his lad should step into the whole property. But there I was firm. I would not have his cursed stock mixed with mine. Not that I had any dislike to the lad, but his blood was in him, and that was enough. I stood firm. McCarthy threatened. I braved him to do his worst. We were to meet at the pool midway between our houses to talk it over. When I went down there, I found him talking with his son, so I smoked a cigar and waited behind a tree until he should be alone. But as I listened to his talk, all that was black and bitter in me seemed to come uppermost. He was urging his son to marry my daughter with as little regard for what she might think as if she were a slut from off the streets. It drove me mad to think that I and all that I held most dear should be in the power of such a man as this. Could I not snap the bond? I was already a dying and a desperate man. Though clear of mind and fairly strong of limb, I knew that my own fate was sealed. But my memory and my girl, both could be saved if I could but silence that foul tongue. I did it, Mr. Holmes. I would do it again. Deeply as I have sinned, I have led a life of martyrdom to atone for it. But that my girl should be entangled in the same meshes which held me was more than I could suffer. I struck him down with no more compunction than if he had been some foul and venomous beast. His cry brought back his son, but I had gained the cover of the wood, though I was forced to go back to fetch the cloak which I had dropped in my flight. That is the true story, gentlemen, of all that occurred. "Well, it is not for me to judge you," said Holmes, as the old man signed the statement which had been drawn out. "I pray that we may never be exposed to such a temptation." "I pray not, sir. And what do you intend to do?" "In view of your health, nothing. You are yourself aware that you will soon have to answer for your deed at a higher court than the assizes. I will keep your confession, and if McCarthy is condemned, I shall be forced to use it. If not, it shall never be seen by mortal eye. And your secret, whether you be alive or dead, shall be safe with us." "Farewell, then," said the old man solemnly. "Your own deathbeds, when they come, will be the easier for the thought of the peace which you have given to mine." Tottering and shaking in all his giant frame, he stumbled slowly from the room. "God help us," said Holmes, after a long silence. "Why does fate play such tricks with poor, helpless worms? I never hear of such a case as this that I do not think of Baxter's words and say, 'There, but for the grace of God, goes Sherlock Holmes.'" James McCarthy was acquitted at the assizes on the strength of a number of objections, which had been drawn out by Holmes and submitted to the defending counsel. Old Turner lived for 7 months after our interview, but he is now dead, and there is every prospect that the son and daughter may come to live happily together in ignorance of the black cloud which rests upon their past. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.